Great. Good morning, everyone, or almost good midday. My name is Benjamin de Carvalho, and I'll be chairing this event. This event is sponsored by NUPI and the Norwegian Centre for Humanitarian Studies, which is a collaborative venture between PRIO, CMI, and NUPI. It's with great pleasure that the illustrious Professor Brent Steele is here. It's taken us some time to get him over, as his schedule is extremely busy. Brent Steele is Professor of Political Science at the University of Utah, where he holds an extremely prestigious chair. He's also, as you well know, the author of a number of books, including Alternative Accountability in Global Politics, Defacing Power, and Ontological Security in International Relations. The list of other publications is much too long for me to refer to here, but do have a look at his stuff. It's great stuff. I'm really looking forward to listening to what he has to say today. Kristoffer Liden from PRIO is sitting in front of me. He will come up here and be filmed as well to comment on the 20 minutes or so talk that Brent will give first, and after that, I'll open up for questions for about half an hour. The floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much, Ben. Thank you all for having me here. I didn't know that I'd have this microphone. I feel like one of the evangelical ministers in my country. Much less charismatic than them as well. No, thank you all for having me here. It's an honor. NUPI has had actually a very big impact on my career and my life as an academic, even though I've never been here, but this is my first time here. So I look forward to seeing many of you again and getting to know many of you that I haven't met yet. So today I'm here to talk about the Bosnia generation, norms of intervention, responsibility to protect, and the importance of Libya. And it relates to an overall interest that I have had going back at least a decade in humanitarianism. When I was going to graduate school, it was in the early 2000s, which was sort of an interesting time in the United States. On the one hand, you had 9/11 and sort of the rupture of 9/11 and the trauma of 9/11. And I should preface my remarks by saying a lot of this is going to be very sort of self-centered and narcissistic from the United States' perspective, which is somewhat redundant because the United States is very self-centered anyway and narcissistic. But the early 2000s were an interesting time. On the one hand, you had 9/11 and the reaction of the United States to that, but then you also had in the 2000s a lot of anniversaries, a lot of 10-year anniversaries of humanitarian disasters where the United States either didn't do something or overreacted to something else, and then failed to even think about intervening. And so in the early 2000s, you had the 10-year anniversary of Somalia, when the United States was ostensibly there for a humanitarian mission, and then it went a little haywire. And then in 2004, you had the 10-year anniversary of Rwanda. And what was happening in the United States at the time, not just in terms of how we approached it intellectually from a graduate school experience, but also in terms of what was around us a lot, in terms of retrospectives on TV, the ways that people thought about and reflected upon Rwanda, was you saw a lot of soul searching in the United States regarding what could have happened if the United States had, for instance, intervened in Rwanda or intervened earlier in Bosnia. And it was interesting because for me, at least in terms of my graduate school training, not a lot of people were talking about the role of humanitarianism in influencing national interests, state interests, security interests. And so I was part of a group of at least U.S. academics, and I think that is probably broader than those of us that were trained in the United States, that were interested in at least analyzing this and figuring out how do we grapple with the ways in which we can understand and reconstruct and interpret the state interests of the United States or others in intervening for humanitarian purposes. And so you see a lot of studies in the early 2000s and the mid 2000s, not just on humanitarian intervention, but a lot of folks dealing with Kosovo, for example, and then trying to grapple with how do we understand humanitarianism after Iraq or during the Iraq War, when humanitarian language was invoked quite a bit by especially U.S. officials, but it was considered by many to be manipulated for political purposes. And so what does that do to humanitarianism? So in this talk today, I'd like to just focus on just a couple of things, looking at the past, looking at the present, especially responsibility to protect, 3 stories by which we can understand the responsibility to protect, and then based on those 3 stories, where does that take us for the future of humanitarianism? So in looking to the past, there are these important, one of the arguments that I think I've focused on is that the 1990s were an important era for the United States, for the West more broadly, and it's what do we take from that decade in terms of is it a decade that is unique, the 1990s, the end of the Cold War, the United States seemingly being a hegemonic power and using its hegemonic power in a variety of ways, including the interest that it takes from stopping or at least responding to humanitarian crisis. Is that a unique decade, or is it a decade that's part of a more progressive transformation of the international system? So in the 1990s into the 2000s, we have these changes from, at least discursively, from the notion of humanitarian intervention to the responsibility to protect. And there are, I would argue, 3 stories in terms of how we get from this notion of humanitarian intervention to the responsibility to protect. And the 3 stories are, in a nutshell, a progressive story about a norm being internalized in the international system, a generational cyclical story, which is still an ordered one, but less progressive and more sort of creative and then destructive, so to speak. And then the 3rd story is just randomness, which, if going to the future of humanitarianism, if that's the story that we focus on, then that might actually, I think that the random story going forward is probably a better characterization of where we're going with humanitarianism, especially from the U.S.'s perspective. So these are the 3 stories that I wanted to focus on in terms of the 1990s going in today. And the progressive one sees the responsibility to protect as this progressive norm that's been internalized in the international system. So in the 1990s, you see these humanitarian crises, and a response to humanitarian crises, a lack of a response. And so figuring out both intellectually and pragmatically how the international community should respond to these crises. And the progressive story argues that we learn, right? We learn internationally, and we see certain events like Rwanda, Bosnia, Kosovo, a few others in the 1990s, and there's a reaction to that and an agreement amongst the international community that it can't just be the possibility of intervening or the right to intervene, but there needs to be a duty to respond to some of these crises that we see unfolding in the 1990s. And the progressive logic is that once that norm becomes internalized, then you no longer are going to have the crises at the scale that you had them in the 1990s. You're no longer going to see that unfold like we see in Rwanda over the course of 3 or 4 months, people hacking each other to death with machetes, that there will be a recognition and then a response to that. And even before you get to that kind of a crisis, that there are going to be other ways in which you can ameliorate or confront humanitarian crisis through all kinds of forms of implementing what some have called human security. And so this progressive logic is actually very popular in the United States, especially amongst many intellectuals. Folks like Anne Marie Slaughter have called the responsibility to protect as sort of this ultimate Magna Carta for our age, that now that you have this moment where the responsibility to protect has been implemented and sort of internalized and at least ratified by a group of core states, that you're no longer going to have the types of crisis that you see in the 1990s. And so if you look at the Libyan intervention of 2011, that appears to be the moment when the responsibility to protect is tested, and there is a passing of the test in 2011 by the countries that become involved and intervene. So that's the progressive logic, and the idea is that if you do have future crisis, you're going to respond to it accordingly and very quickly. The generational cycle argument, which is the one that I favor a little bit more, especially in terms of ordering what has happened in the past, argues that actually there are ebbs and flows in terms of humanitarian response. And actually the responsibility to protect in terms of its implementation is only implemented because in the late 2000s you have folks who experience a sort of a group of formative experiences in the 1990s through a Western lens, by the way. So when you hear the words or terms Rwanda or Bosnia, it's not as if they're on the ground necessarily experiencing that and experiencing ethnic cleansing or genocide. They are watching their countries not intervening, and so that experience is traumatic for them. But it's a different type of trauma than the folks that are on the ground actually experiencing it. But in the 1990s, they were experiencing this this group of folks, what I've titled the Bosnian generation, and others have titled the Bosnian generation. This group of Western elites that get into power in the 2000s. And can actually start to influence, especially in the United Kingdom, but I focus mostly on the United States. Folks like Samantha Power, who's currently the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, and Anne-Marie Slaughter, who worked for the State Department, the U.S. State Department, until 2011. They get into positions of power, and they take the set of experiences, formative experiences of the early 1990s and the humanitarian crises during that time, and they use that as a schema for how the United States should implement, it should both define and implement its national interest. And what they take, that group, the generational cycle argument, is that they take a set of experiences that not only can intervention stop abuses, but that it is feasible, whether through air power and the combination of air power and then on the ground having some kind of sort of loose allied force on the ground in the form of the Kosovo Liberation Army in the late 1990s, or in the case of Libya in 2011, the rebels, or at the very least you can set up these no-fly zones, and that at least through air power you can handle both the idea that the cost of intervention is not worth it, but this concern that intervention is not necessarily worth the cost from a national standpoint, that at least through air power you can reduce the cost to your own military on the one hand, and on the other hand stem some humanitarian crisis. And so this generational cycle argument is that different generations embody the national security structures of states, and in the case of the United States, you have a generation that is not only reacting to events on the ground and taking the formative experiences from the early 1990s to the late 2000s and implementing them, but they're reacting to another generation. In the 1990s, it wasn't just these crises that were happening. There was this understanding by this Bosnia generation of U.S. elites, especially and UK elites, that this notion of a realist understanding of national security interests, that there is no interest in saving strangers and using your own power, that it's that group and that way of thinking in the 1990s that they're reacting to, and they see as the wrong way to handle foreign policy. And so this understanding, again, reacts to not just events on the ground, but causal logic of who's in power at the time and what they're implementing in terms of their own understanding of national security interests, and reacting negatively to that and saying, we're not going to do that. We don't know necessarily what we're going to do when we get into power, but we're not going to do what they did in the 1990s, which was define the national interest in such a narrow way that you will let genocide go, if not unnoticed and uncalled, at least not responding to it. So if this is the case, generational cycles, and this goes into the future humanitarianism in a second, if this is the case that generational cycles are the story that we use to sort of narrate the 1990s into the 2000s, if that's the case, then it's not a progressive marching of history. That the responsibility to protect is a norm, but it's a norm that is enacted by a particular generation that has a set of formative experiences in the 1990s, gets into power in the 2000s, and then will eventually go out of power, and another generation will come in and implement their understanding of what's in the national security interest of their nations accordingly, and maybe even oppositely of the Bosnian generation. And I think if we think about those policymakers who had a set of formative experiences, some of them as soldiers actually in Operation, as they call it, Iraqi Freedom. Those of us that have been sort of formatively shaped by the 2000s and the U.S. experience in Iraq especially, what those folks, when they get into power, what they might do in the future in terms of what they consider to be and not to be in the national interest of a country. The third argument is that it's random or haphazard, that we really can't, by implementing some kind of logic, either progressive or generational cycles, which is also a logic, it's not necessarily progressive, that we're actually trying to see some type of pattern of humanitarian response that really isn't there. And there are some folks, especially in the United States, that issue this charge to the Obama administration, that the Obama administration suffers from a lack of grand strategy, that there's no real grand strategy to Obama's foreign policy, and that it doesn't really have any kind of plan or set definitions of the national security interest of the United States and then implements them. And more broadly, this is an argument that I think social scientists need to at least confront, and that is, at least when it comes to grand politics or high politics or conflict, that there may not be the types of patterns that we are looking for, that it may just be haphazard, and that it could just be on a case-to-case basis. Now, you could have sort of a combination of the generational cycles and the random haphazard understanding of the Libyan intervention, for example. You could argue that, on the one hand, the Obama administration had some of these folks from the Bosnian generation of elites that were there, advising them to intervene in Libya. But the only reason that they did it in Libya and not in Syria and some other places was because it was feasible. You could do it through air power and through an allied force with some NATO partners. But the reason why you don't see the Bosnian generation then be able to advocate to Obama within the Obama administration, and maybe to the same degree to the Cameron administration in the United Kingdom, is that on a case-by-case basis, there are just certain situations that can't be ameliorated through air power or even an intervention. And so you could have this, what appears to us to be a random, haphazard way of looking at humanitarian response, but it could also be sort of conditioned by the generation that's in there. So going forward, in terms of the future of humanitarianism, and then I'll turn it over to my discussant. Regarding responsibility to protect, you could still have the progressive logic of the responsibility to protect going forward. Just because you haven't had some interventions in the last few years after Libya, that doesn't necessarily mean that the responsibility to protect, especially the advocates of the responsibility to protect, would say that does not necessarily mean that the norm has been devalued. It is just that the focus perhaps in the responsibility to protect, and there are other aspects of the responsibility to protect, the advocates would say much more important aspects of the responsibility to protect, that they might be focusing on short of intervention, right? So the responsibility that rests on the state and the sovereign state to protect its own citizens might be emphasized a little bit more, or other ways to respond or even preempt humanitarian crisis before it happens. So there could be not necessarily a devaluing of the norm, but if the progressive logic holds and the progressive story goes forward, it could be that the norm is just reconfigured in terms of how it is implemented. So that could be the way that we could look at humanitarianism in the future. And if we think about the different aspects of, for instance, human security, that can somehow be, or sometimes be linked to the responsibility to protect, especially health security, right? Health humanitarian response. If we think about the ways that even the United States nowadays, I mean, it's all over. Ebola is the most important thing that you've ever seen in the United States right now, even though only 2 to 3 people in the United States have it. And so people are kind of freaking out there in the United States regarding Ebola. And so what is it that what's the language in terms of how to actually confront Ebola? There's sort of a logic of, well, the United States needs to go over and provide, along with the rest of the international community, provide some assistance in Liberia on the ground and in Sierra Leone to stem Ebola. And I think that that logic isn't necessarily mutually exclusive from the logic of the responsibility to protect. So there could be a focus on other aspects other than military intervention that could still be sort of invoked to implement the responsibility to protect. If it's a generational story that we're focusing on, you know, what does it mean for generations that experienced, at least from the United States standpoint, the intervention in Iraq, the Iraq War, and what lessons do they take from the Iraq War? That could be one way that we could look at intervention going forward, is that there's going to be a lot less of an interventionist predisposition to those folks that experienced the 2000s and the lessons they took from them. But I also think, especially if we're thinking about generations, that there is what we call the millennial generation in the United States, and they are much more focused globally. I mean, they're much more sort of involved globally. And so they might not necessarily think that the United States or they themselves as the millennial generation needs to be advocating for military interventions, but they might sort of look at some of these other ways in which to engage the world that they think is important. And of course, the way in which technology interacts with that, produces that, and is reproduced by that is important. And then, of course, there's the random haphazard model. That there's just no way to predict when and if any of this is going to happen, when and if an intervention or a norm is going to be reinforced or executed upon in the future. And that, as social scientists, that might be a very daunting possibility indeed. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Brent. Both listening to you now and reading your article from the Global Responsibility to Protect journal has been very refreshing in terms of revisiting the debates on the R2P and how to go about this. There has been a certain story or narrative of this development that's been established in the work of Alex Bellamy and others, writing on the politics of the responsibility to protect. That needs a kind of refreshing alternative. And I think you provide that through your focus on generational analysis. And also because it's a very clear statement, so it's easy to criticize, and it asks for responses and new debates. So the questions that I'm left with regarding that analytical perspective is to what extent those elites that you describe are representative of a wider generation that allows this intervention in Libya and these political developments to unfold. What is it really that allow these actors, these elites, to act, and is that reducible to this generational perspective? And you don't really make such a strong claim that it's all reducible to this. You come up with all the caveats that I would then come up with as counter arguments to your perspective, and you mention them in your paper. Still, I find that interesting. That question very interesting, and also from the perspective of more general sociological debates on social action versus social structure and systems perspective. I think you provoke that by clarifying the where some of the agency lies in these developments. Turning to the broader political context of this Libya intervention. You frame it as a humanitarian intervention, as something related to R2P. You, in your analysis of the conditions of possibility for this, you emphasize that it's probably not reducible to R2P. It's about the environmental, the contextual factors that allow this, and it's about the more personal stories of those actors involved. So not so much about the norm or an ideological commitment. This is very reasonable and the story that you tell about interventions throughout the 90s and 2000s, at some point you present them as inconsistent and somehow, let's see what you call it, as inconsistent and somehow frustrating from a humanitarian intervention perspective, and I think that relies on the story that this is about humanitarian interventions, inconsistent application of humanitarian intervention, and I don't think that's really the most plausible way of analyzing this story, as you yourself says in the caveats on the contextual factors. Is it really about? Is it really a story of humanitarian intervention? These experiences that some of these actors like Samantha Powers and others experienced throughout the 90s. Did they think of it as a humanitarian crisis in this respect and as the failure of humanitarian intervention, or is that a narrative that we tell after the debates in late 90s and early 2000s on R2P and humanitarian intervention and so on? A narrative that Alex Bellamy has been very central in establishing. Another aspect of your analysis relies on these historical events and how they shape these generations. So you get the impression that there are these historical facts that a generation is going through. They experience it as if they experienced the war, and they're transformed by it. And it sounds as if ideas or theories, worldviews are somewhat less relevant or in the background. But from the perspective of explanation in IR, I wonder whether that would downplay the role of interpretation or worldviews in interpreting these historical facts. So while I think your perspective is valid, I think it should not be taken as an argument against the importance of theory, worldview, ideology to this kind of analysis. So for instance, Beate Jan, in her work on the tragedy of liberal diplomacy, she interprets some of the same events as just another round of a liberal worldview meeting a certain historical context. So she would not interpret the current, intervention in Libya as from this, generational perspective, but rather a very resilient, tragic liberal worldview meeting a new historical context and not being able to learn from past mistakes. So that would be an emphasis on the worldview, on the ideology, more than the kind of historical facts, and I think both are important. Then finally, an obvious point would be to point to the other actors. You yourself said that focusing on the US was somehow, egocentric. It's not at all. It's extremely relevant. And I recently had a lecture on international intervention, talking about a series of interventions, relating them to UN doctrine and so on. The next speaker talked about US national security strategy and counterinsurgency strategy, talked about exact the same events and didn't mention the UN or the international. And he seemed to explain the things much better than I did. So focusing on the US and these aspects is a very important corrective to this general discourse of international intervention. But still focusing on Russia and China and their role in terms of the debates on Libya and the Libya resolution. would certainly be an important addendum, and also probably it would be extremely interesting with such a generational perspective on Chinese diplomats, Russian diplomats, and how their current, positions in the Security Council are formed through their, through their formative experiences. That would be really interesting follow-up to this. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I will stand here. Brent, do you want to respond to that? Or do you want to?
Well, I mean,
Or not,
I can I can do either. I have a couple things I'd respond to there, but if we want to get a few other.
Take a few minutes and then we'll have a.
Well, those are fantastic comments, and I guess I should have prefaced it even more by saying that when it comes to those of us that are writing on responsibility to protect, and so I've done a lot of work with Eric Heinze, a friend and colleague of mine that is much more up to speed on the genealogy of responsibility to protect than even I am. But we definitely come at responsibility to protect from a much more critical angle. And actually, more broadly, I mean, it's to Alex Bellamy's credit that on the one hand, he has this journal that actually has this normative purpose of getting responsibility to protect, sort of intellectually implemented as its own norm. And so he, along with a few others, started this global responsibility to protect. But it's to his credit that he's publishing, at least in his journal, perspectives like ours that are a little bit more critical than that. And so, but we're definitely critics of the responsibility to protect and this notion that not only responsibility to protect is a norm, but that Libya has that level of significance out there. The third point that you made, third or fourth point that you made, there's a lot of good points here, and so we'll have to chat about them over coffee at least at some point. But the point about historical experiences versus interpretation, I actually see I see not only a lot of overlap, but this generational analysis argument actually can't work without understanding the ways in which worldviews inform the causal logic in which we interpret historical experiences. And so you have the Bosnian liberals, sometimes they're called the Bosnian liberals. And then there was also a sort of gendered aspect as well, where everyone was pointing out that, well, all these people that advocated in the United States, at least, for an intervention were women, right? So what does that mean? But to not go down that route, but to go down the route of the worldview, I think that is important because they were liberals. They did see that there is a causal logic to why you have these failures, that it is not just a sort of tragic fallen world like a lot of the classical realists would inform us, is sort of characterizes the world, but that there are evils out there, and you can, through intervention, stop them. And then you have others, who are more informed with, more of the limits of politics view, a realist view, who interpret the causal logic a little bit differently, and they use the worldview to understand not just how to respond to some of these historically traumatic experiences, but what's producing them in the first place. And so I think that causal logic does impact the way in which we experience and interpret the world, even though it is a little bit cleaner to just say there's this experience, 15 years later they get into power, and then they react to that, almost as if they're hallucinating from the early 1990s into present day. That sounds a little bit cleaner than I think that it really is.
Thank you. I have 4 people down, and while I know most of you, Brent may not know you, so please introduce yourselves when I give you the microphone.
Should I stand up?
Look at the camera.
Oh, where's the camera?
There's 4 of them.
Okay.
There's 4 of them.
I'm Ole Jakob Sending. I work here at NUPI. I have one question. You wrote a piece with Oded Lovenheim a few years back, where the argument is that we can understand many of the wars and the use of military force by looking at how great powers...
Great power authority.
Yes, they construe threats, and at a certain threshold, they intervene in order to reconstitute themselves as great powers. How does that logic, that seems to be a 4th plausible explanation for what's going on here. So that's basically one question. The other ties in with what you and Kristoffer has already discussed, which is, it seems to me that the generational logic can at least be construed as a supplement to both of the other explanations, both the norm explanation, depending a little bit on how you define the norm. It's perhaps not fully internalized, etc. And as you said, the random haphazard logic. But then you could also add a fourth or fifth, which is the changes in the broader system, which is more closer to the great power authority story. And there, I think, if you look at the fallout after the Libya resolution and the intervention with regards to Russia and China,
China, yeah.
and you look at great power authority, that story there, it seems perhaps to be a better fit than the generational logic in its pure version, at least. Yeah.
We'll take two more, and you'll have a chance to respond, and then I have three more people after that.
Yes, thank you. My name is Berg, Minister of Foreign Affairs, retired, I should say. Thank you very much for a highly interesting introduction. Now, two questions or two comments. The first comment would be like this. Okay, call it humanitarian intervention responsibility to protect. This, of course, is not a new thing. If you go back to, let's say, the Greek, Turkish, British War in the 1820s, go back to the Balkans in the 1870s, long strand of human intervention in the diplomatic vocabulary. So I should think that if there's a crisis anywhere, and there's a smack of humanitarian intervention and things like that, there's a group together, a task force, representatives of Minister of Foreign Affairs, State Department, or the White House possibly, and then because of the human experience, so many people know what is a human intervention, what is the responsibility to protect, they will, of course, start thinking in these terms. They didn't quite do that before, but now they will do it because the thing is well known. Now, of course, you have air power, we used very recently in Libya and what have you. So those who advocate humanitarian intervention, of course, will have a reservoir of instruments much more refined and subtle than people, let's say, 15 years ago. Now, again, back to the ISIL intervention in Iraq. It is kind of peculiar is, of course, that, let's say, except the fact that the Americans, the US government, evidently looked through the eyes a little bit with what was happening in Syria, accumulation of the ISIL forces. It's not very easy to hide 500 gleaming white Toyota vans. So they must have known. They didn't do anything before the ISIL started to go into Iraq and threatening the Kurdish territory and threatening also Americans in Mosul. So I take it that the argument used for intervening, implying air power, is, of course, very much a question of humanitarian intervention, avoiding massacres. I accept that as an argument which is valid. But at the same time, I think that the argument, of course, to protect the American interest in Mosul is also. So it just shows it's a complicated thing. There's never one single reason behind intervention. It's a strand. It's a different batch. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our last speaker, formerly of the House.
Yeah, Anders Lomenheim, used to work here, now at the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies. Thanks for a very interesting talk. I have a couple of issues that I'm wondering about and like you to elaborate on. It seems like it seems like you redefine the humanitarian as part of a national interest. And is that really useful? Is it more a concern that's hard to get into a national interest? And if we take the case of Libya, Robert Gates was the most outspoken, and he was very clear that he couldn't fit this into a national interest. So if you encounter realist politicians like him, or realist scholars like me, they're going to be very protective on what they want to get inside the concept of interest. So I'm just wondering if that's a necessary thing. Potentially it is necessary to get the national security apparatus of the state in motion to call it an interest. I don't know, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. And the other thing is consistency. Is consistency really necessary? Michael Walzer has a great argument stating that providing some supreme emergencies, that you can't root them all out, doesn't mean that you shouldn't take what you can. So is it just this judicial equality before the law kind of thinking that is, in a sense, injected into this debate, where consistency in itself isn't really something we'll ever get, because as you see, the feasibility decides where we end up with an intervention. And finally, if you'd like to elaborate on what you consider the most critical factors contributing to feasibility, that would be great. Thanks. That's 3 large ones. Pardon me.
Thank you. And if you will respond to that in 2 minutes. No, take your time. We're okay.
Oh wow. These are great points. I actually find myself nodding, not just to acknowledge the point, but because I'm in agreement with most of everything that was just stated, either in the form of a question or a comment. Yeah, Ole Jakob. I mean, there is. There definitely is, and at times in the United States Academy, we tried to look at all of these things through sort of, is it realist or is it liberal? But you know, there are some of us, especially folks like myself and the noted Lowenheim, who find at least the English school's way to interpret the world very very useful, at least in this case. And there is that, you know, famous quote in Hedley Bull's Anarchical Society that the great powers are the custodians, right, of the international society. And I think Oded and I, when we were working on that article about great power authority, we were definitely, you know, drawing from some of these English school frameworks. And obviously the English school has a whole nother, related debate between the solidarists and the pluralists regarding humanitarian intervention. And if you add sort of a great power element there, that the great powers are the ones that actually can execute upon these principles of international society, you kind of see where we were going in that article, and definitely that puts you in between the norms that are out there in terms of principles, and then the embodied norms by the great powers that influence the system or the principles of international society, and what sort of logic of order is out there. Is it a little bit more pluralist, where we value sovereignty over everything else, or is it a little bit more solidarist, where we value human rights or justice, right? Order versus justice. So I completely agree. And if that's the case, then it is a little. I think actually one of the themes of the several comments that were out there is it humanitarian or is it self-interest? And to be honest, I mean, that characterized a lot of the early 2000s debates on how do we know a humanitarian intervention when we see one, right? In terms of how do we interpret it. And I mean, it's just not that clear cut. You're always going to find self-interest overlapping with humanitarian interest, and then what is humanitarian and what is self-interest always gets redefined as well. So it's a sort of triple dynamic that's out there. But if it's the case that it's great powers that are intervening in order to reconstitute their authority, then that doesn't look very humanitarian at all, right? And so I actually think that we could play sort of that game. Now, I don't want to call it a game, but we could definitely go down that route where we say, well, there's some humanitarian diplomatic language or rhetoric is what you called it. There is some humanitarian language or rhetoric that's invoked, even if there's, you know, some overall consideration of realist national interests that are out there. And I think that's important, but what's important, there's a couple of things that are important there. One is the importance of rhetoric and language. Where are they drawing their rhetoric from, and why, if they are manipulating meanings, where are those meanings in the first place that they can manipulate? So I think that's an important aspect that should sort of draw our attention. And, you know, if I could sort of like couch, you know, my last comment here in response to both of the two comments that were really important in terms of visuality and how we actually, you know, sort of what are the visual aspects that sort of bring out a response. And then what's going on in Iraq and Syria currently, today. I think your comment was relevant to what's been happening over the last 5 or 6 months in terms of U.S. response to Iraq and Syria. In the United States, you definitely had sort of a little bit of a discussion over the intervention regarding the Kurds and ISIS surrounding the Yazidis. Is that how I pronounce it correctly? And intervening in that case, but obviously the visuality that has prompted a complete change in the context in which the United States has faced ISIS were the beheadings, the videos of the beheadings, and you know that is a case where it is there is not a core sort of judicial way in which we go about responding to a particular crisis or a particular atrocity. I mean, it's interesting that a couple of beheadings, which are tragic and awful and terrible, generates much more of a response in the United States than the other video of how many Iraqi soldiers were executed in that video of ISIS 5 or 6 months before that, right? That doesn't generate as much of a response in the United States as the beheadings of a couple of these people. So there is a visual aspect of it. There is also an aspect of not just the visual, but the narrative in which we respond and sort of make sense of those visual sort of presentations and representations that are nowadays on our computer screens, not even on our television screens. And so I think that's important, and that's why I'm in broad agreement with, I think, both of you, that it isn't as if there is just this consistency out there that, you know, once we see, you know, we have these 4 or 5 criteria of what is a humanitarian crisis. Once all of those are triggered, then there's a response. I mean, it is a lot more complicated than that, and it's a lot more political than that. And that's why what we study is just as much political as it is sort of legal or judicial.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, hello, my name is Jon Harald. I also work here at NUPI. I get the impression from your speech now that it seems like you equate humanitarianism with military intervention, and then R2P is this kind of humanitarian intervention. The issue of narcissism was also raised initially. So I'm just wonder, would you see this debate on R2P and the talk that you give now if it took from a humanitarian perspective? Because humanitarianism is more than military intervention, you know. And how does the R2P ID challenge these fundamental ideas of humanitarianism, of being apolitical, you know, of neutrality, impartiality? And what does it do with the humanitarian space? And also, is this just an expression of a new humanitarian mission creep? Short questions, but I think it deserves a long answer. Maybe not here, but still. Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Pia Isaksætre. I'm a political scientist, specialized in international affairs. I had the honor to protect my homeland for over a decade as advisor to the Chief of Defense, mainly on NATO affairs. And I even met POTUS once. I am very happy that this week all Norwegians got the equal opportunity to protect their homeland when the parliament decided that conscription now applied to all men and women. You mentioned Ebola, and something that people, of course, are scared of. I would like to underline that it's not only our responsibility to physically protect, but also by making the people feel safe. Unfortunately, we have certain politicians here in Norway who try to scare people into keeping them in power by saying that if you don't vote for us, bad things will happen to you and your family. I think that's shameful in a democracy. What do you think? Thanks.
Thank you very much. We will take, we have 3 more, so I think we'll take that, and then we'll...
Mathea Peter, also at NUPI. Some of it you already touched on, sort of this discussion between how to differentiate between humanitarian and self-interest discussion. But I was wondering if you could potentially bring in a discussion about the sub-Saharan Africa. in this discourse, and particularly whether our discussion on whether Libya is a humanitarian or R2P and Syria is an R2P should be discussed in the context of the lack of discussion and the lack of action. And I wonder how much the lack of action in sub-Saharan Africa actually challenges your idea of a generational narrative, because all those people were sort of formed through the Rwanda crisis as well. So, thanks.
Thank you. I actually think we'll give you the chance to respond because I have 3 more, and so we'll have that as the last round after that.
Okay. No, I'm mic'd up here. Those are great points. If I could just, I'm not going to be able to respond effectively. I don't think ever because you bring up such important, almost. There are separate research programs that could be developed trying to respond to what you brought up. I would just bring up one observation, and that was that the advocates of R2P, right, the authors sort of R2P were very concerned and careful in the spring of 2011 to try to argue that it wasn't R2P that led to the Libyan intervention, which is interesting, right? And they were making the same exact argument that out of their concern for the notion that R2P would get latched on to just military intervention. Kind of what I've argued here is sort of folding everything of humanitarianism into military intervention. They were very careful that they were trying to argue that you can't just equate R2P with military intervention. And in fact, there are all of these other aspects, this holistic sort of approach to humanitarian or to crisis in general that you need to look at before you can even sort of justify an intervention. But I think, I mean, the word humanitarian is like much of what we're talking about. It's a word that is very politically loaded. And the minute that you call something humanitarian, that's a political act. It's not just a definitional sort of way of characterizing something. And so, as somebody who has studied language quite a bit and the way that political leaders use language and manipulate language, and not just political leaders, but the way in which that circulates in a lot of broader contexts, not just in society, but in micro-political settings, which is sort of where my work is going nowadays. I'm very sensitive to that. And so I need to be perhaps a little bit more not just reflective, but reflexive in terms of how I use that. And what I call humanitarian is sort of a convenient term, but it is not necessarily, it shouldn't be taken as a point of advocacy that I am saying that just because we call this humanitarian doesn't mean it is humanitarian in some universalist notion of how we define it. In terms of the manipulation of fear for political purposes, that's a great point. We see that quite a bit in the United States. I think what I'm interested in is not just how fear is manipulated for political purposes and how security threats are constructed by politicians for political purposes, but I'm also interested in what the limits are to that as well. And yeah, I mean, in the 2000s, you got to the point where everything was connected to terrorism in the United States, at least. And again, this is self-centered and very narcissistic from a U.S. standpoint. I'm just drawing on these examples, but you got to a point where one of the only forms of resistance that you could find in terms of how many times it would go back to this well of manipulating fear was in comedy. And, you know, it was, comedians sort of doing really good takes on emptying out the sort of seriousness of the manipulation of fear by pointing to some of the folly or ridiculousness of how much everything was connected. And so you'd have a war on drugs that was sort of connected to, you'd have the National Drug Council in the United States talking about essentially if you smoke a marijuana joint, you're emboldening and making more powerful bin Laden, right? There's some kind of causal logic there that I couldn't follow, but that was what you'd see, at halftime of some of these U.S. football games, some of the commercials that you'd see. And so for me, I think that it's somewhat of a consistent sort of behavior to manipulate fear for political purposes. What I'm interested in are the forms of resistance, or at least the ways in which we can sort of acknowledge that while also figuring out, okay, what are the limits of how much they can manipulate this? We're seeing it a lot when it comes to Ebola in the United States, that a lot of folks in the media and even some politicians are making a lot of, they're manipulating the fear over Ebola, which is a very small chance of this being, becoming a pandemic in the United States at least. And, you know, what are the ways in which that they reach their limitations of how much they can manipulate that? But it's definitely an incentive for a lot of these politicians to do that. Sub-Saharan Africa, I do, this is Matea's point, there definitely is a problem with a lack of response to what's happening in Africa. And it's part of some of the broader sort of interpretations of the ways in which the West in general and the United States specifically responds to Africa and Africans. And that there definitely is a racial element there, and there definitely is, if not a lack of exposure, a way of interpreting this as being a condition of Africa rather than some sort of problem or you know, political condition in other parts of the world that you can stop. And so I think that's definitely, I'm not saying that that's the right way to look at it, but I think there is a distinction that happens aesthetically, visually, when you have a representation or a coverage of particular things that are happening in sub-Saharan Africa that's different from the way in which it's represented in other parts of the world, and then how you respond to that as well. And so that's part of a broader, I think, problematic problem or set of problems that especially the advocates of R2P need to confront. I mean, one of the other things that you see in the 2000s is that humanitarianism, to the extent that it's a more holistic approach, the idea is that, well, we're responding to Africa in our own ways in the United States. We're responding to it by, you know, confronting the health crisis or HIV and AIDS or Bono and some of the ways in which there are other ways to respond to African problems than intervention. But I think it's not a coincidence that the two biggest sort of traumatic points for the U.S. in the early 1990s are Somalia on the one hand and Rwanda on the other. But in terms of that impacting the way in which the United States has responded, especially the United States has responded to problems in sub-Saharan Africa since then, it's a little bit more complicated than that.
Thank you. We are actually reaching our end time, so we'll take 3 very quick questions and a quick rejoinder.
Okay, sorry, I'm going on. Okay.
I'm Eli Stamnes, also from NUPI. I have a question about academics' role in how the future of the R2P norm is unfolding. And you talked about Alex's journal, and as you know, in the field of R2P, there's a lot of the blurred lines between advocacy and academic work. It's not just looking for patterns, it's clear advocacy. Does it matter whether we tell one story or the other? Does it matter academics doing that? Will Alex's journal have an impact on the role? And I think a lot of our us working on R2P, we are definitely from the Bosnia generation. So will a new generation of academics have a different impact? And what is your role in all this? Small questions.
Julie Williamson, also with NUPI. I don't work on R2P, so I was interested in the entire Western debate on R2P, and just coming back from Beijing and working on Russian politics, I'm interested in whether the Chinese rejection of what's been of the principle of intervention in the way that it has been carried through, if that at all plays into the debate in the West, if they're noticing how forceful that reaction is. Secondly, is it debated and are they noticing the copycat effect which comes from the use of intervention, which is obvious in the Crimean case where you have suddenly Putin taking all these words into his mouth, construing it as partly a humanitarian intervention. Is that, you know, are people understanding the consequences of the last, of the time since Kosovo? Thank you.
Our last question.
Thank you very much for your talk. Gintin Zuberi from the Norwegian Centre of Human Rights. When we speak about R2P, I think it's important to point out that the 2005 World Summit Outcome Document, to the paragraphs 138 to 140, and to the debates in the UN General Assembly about this, and the Secretary General's reports from 2009 to 2014, in order to at least to point out the international law aspect of it and the understanding of states of R2P. And the scope of R2P is limited to protecting populations from mass atrocity crimes, right? So what I'm wondering here is, do we really need to use R2P to include pandemics like the Ebola epidemics, humanitarian disasters like in Burma, and other problems, other humanitarian disasters? Do we really need R2P, or should we leave R2P alone and try to use the language that it already is to face these types of challenges? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
How much time? 40 seconds? Again, a great set of observations and comments and questions. I'll try to respond as quickly as possible. I have another sort of set of research interest in the academic's role, the reflexive role of the scholar, of the international relations scholar, or scholars in general. And so I've been thinking quite a bit about this, and my colleague, Eric Heinze, is that is actually his core interest when it comes to the debates over responsibility to protect, is not necessarily just what is responsibility to protect, what do we invoke it for, whatever, but what does this say about academics explicitly embodying an advocacy role when it comes to, you know, drawing from their intellectual and scholastic sort of experiences and then going out and trying to influence what they study. For me, I'm more generally interested in the ways in which academics don't just, theorists don't just do that explicitly, but some of the practices that we embody unintentionally or implicitly that go out there and change that as well. I guess in terms of my own role, I would at the very least like us to acknowledge what this means as social scientists in the United States. International relations is still within the field of political science. What that means as social scientists in terms of our scientific engagement of the world, that we're actually influencing what we study as opposed to the natural or physical scientists that can go out there and be scientists and don't necessarily transform what they're actually studying. And so I'd like at least social scientists to grapple with that. And then if they grapple with that, then they at least think about some of these topics of reflexivity. The Chinese and Russians have been brought up quite a bit here, and I think that's important. One of the things that I think the progressives, at least the progressives that sort of see R2P as this norm that gets embodied and internalized into the international system, but they're not acknowledging is that sometimes you can invoke a norm, and it can be counterproductive for the norm itself. And so there is no way that you're going to get a Security Council resolution ever again that's going to say, or at least leave as much wiggle room as Resolution 1973 did in 2011, and get it past the Russians and the Chinese. It's just not going to happen. But the additional step here is that the Russians are invoking interventionist and humanitarian type language to be able to justify the intervention in the Crimea and the eastern Ukraine as well. I don't think the progressives understand, I mean, in my view, I'm not necessarily progressive, but I don't think they understand that there can be unintentional consequences to having a norm, invoking a norm, and then not seeing the norm lead to another improvement of the human condition, but that it could actually be counterproductive for the norm itself and then what the norm is supposed to be doing. So I'm very critical of the literature on norms that we sort of see that's out there in international relations, and especially regarding R2P in this respect. That I don't, and American policymakers in general just don't get that as well. I think they're starting to come to grips with it now, but it doesn't make as much headlines as the original intervention did. And no, I don't necessarily think we need R2P to be able to do that. But again, you know, all of these words that we sort of invoke as if they are self-evident, right? And I did that as well when I talked about humanitarian. I'm invoking that word as if it's self-evident. Mass atrocity, you know, that sounds like it's a pretty objective category, but that could also be reconstrued as, well, a pandemic can be an atrocity, right? It can be something else that you can respond to. That doesn't necessarily mean that we need the responsibility to protect to do it. In fact, I would argue that the responsibility to protect is largely we call this, Professor Heinze and I call this a speech act. I mean, it's largely a speech act that's used to sort of recontextualize the basis for response, but you don't necessarily need it to be able to respond to some of these things. But again, some of it is, you know, these categories that we have of humanitarian and atrocity, they're a little bit more contingent than they are objective. So that's all.
Well, on this note, let me apologize for having failed utterly to keep track of time. But please join me in thanking our IR's version of the evangelical preacher with a less than salvatory message. Thank you also to Kristoffer for commenting.
Yep, thank you all.
And let me add, to those of you who have become fans, Brent Steele will be in the next room, I think.